Well, hello, and thank you for joining us for this deep dive discussion. My name is John, and I'm here with Pastor Shawn Scarborough. He's the lead pastor of Family Worship Center in Lakeland, Florida. And our goal for these conversations is to dig deeper into the gospel of God as we unpack some key points from Pastor Shawn's Sunday messages. So we hope that this will be a catalyst for discipleship in your life and hopefully lead to more conversations with your family, your friends, and your small groups. So Pastor Shawn, you've been in this series called 40 Days. And so there seems to be a lot of significance to 40 days throughout the gospel. And so week one was really centered around Matthew chapter 4 when Jesus is led into the wilderness for 40 days. Now, if you are tuning in today and you haven't been caught up on this series, this might not be the most helpful conversation. So my advice to you is press pause, go to our YouTube page, catch up, listen to this series, and then join us again. And I think some things might make a little bit more sense. So, so week one, you hit on this concept of Jesus being led into the wilderness. And you said some things that I feel like are new concepts, at least for me. Growing up in church and hearing about the Bible, the word wilderness is tossed around a lot of different ways. Yeah. And so you kind of made a point that that wilderness doesn't necessarily mean this place of suffering and misery. Lots of times, at least I've heard, this phrase, it's my wilderness season. Yeah. It's just my wilderness season. And so, but you kind of hit on the fact that it's more so about this place, a physical place, of simplicity, of quiet, maybe inconvenience, but it's more so a place that we can go and hear from God. And so I'd love for you to hit more on that. Like, has there been maybe seasons in your life where you thought, oh, well, this is just a wilderness season, but then you look back and you think, well, that wasn't actually a wilderness. Can you bring us to this place of maybe recognizing when might be being led into the wilderness ourselves rather than feeling like we're being dragged into this place by God because we need to, until you learn this here, then you can't have blessing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I probably had a lot of the similar experience conversation that you had. It was usually if somebody was sick or if somebody had lost a job or something sort of catastrophic. And whatever happened after that, whatever season of time passed after they did lose the job or they did realize that there was a diagnosis or whatever, they would define afterwards as a wilderness season. And at the end, it usually seemed like a wilderness season by that definition was you had things together, then you lost things, and by the end of it, you were back where you started. And if you go into the Word and just look at when wilderness times were inserted in the gospel, they were always far better at the end of something than when they started. So if you go back and you look at, obviously, the 40 years in the wilderness, they learned to trust God in that place. They went from a position of slavery, and while they were in the wilderness, they weren't slaves. They had autonomy. They went from place to place. God provided manna. He provided water out of rocks. He provided victories in battles. So yes, they were in the wilderness, meaning they weren't in the promised land, but they were far better than when they were in slavery. Right. So just that kind of puts you on this journey of just kind of seeing what else could this mean. And I don't want to take away from somebody having gone through a hard season and they're calling it a wilderness season. I'm not taking away from that. I'm just saying this can be more intentional than reactive. Yeah. And a lot of times what we call a wilderness is just a negative reaction to something bad that happens. Where if it's intentional, where they were led into the wilderness and they were there to be proven before they stepped into the promised land, or if you look in, which is what we covered in Matthew, when Jesus went into the wilderness, it was a season of testing, and then he, of course, emerged on the other side of that and went into ministry. So it seems like we can intentionally step into a season of hearing from God. I think fasting would absolutely fall into that category. We see that with the Apostle Paul. After he had his experience on the road to Damascus, then he went into the wilderness of Arabia and was there for like 3.5 years. Yeah. So And he said there he received the gospel not from men, but rather from God himself. So I see it as a very intentional space where we get alone with God. We let some things go that would distract us from hearing his voice. And yeah, there might be inconvenience and it might slow things down. But, and there is fasting is self-inflicted suffering, right? Like if I choose to fast, I'm not eating. If I want to say that's miserable, it's absolutely miserable. But there's a difference in me choosing to fast and I don't have enough money to buy food. And when you look at the wilderness experiences in the Bible, God fed them manna. They weren't starving. Jesus chose to not eat for 40 days. So it wasn't that he couldn't afford it. So it is a little different, I think, than sometimes in a modern context we put it.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful because I know for my life, I've almost painted it in like a negative sense, right?
Yeah.
Like I've done something wrong,
Yeah.
and so now I'm being led into the wilderness
Yeah.
until I make those things right. Really, it sounds like you're saying, it's a blessing. It's a place you hear from God. We should look at it as a blessing. It's not, we're not far from God in the wilderness. Mm-hmm. But rather drawing to him.
Yeah.
So I think that's really helpful. And, it's rather than also looking at it as like, I think I've always looked at it as seasons. So 3 years in the wilderness, 2 years out. But you talked about it being a physical place. You kind of have talked, and this ties into the following week of the mountain.
Yeah.
You could go into your mountain. But we can potentially have these wilderness places throughout the year of throughout the year, the calendar year, throughout even maybe a week, we can go into the wilderness to hear from God, right? So should we be more aware of that in our day-to-day rather than waiting for some big event to happen? Should we be more sensitive to the Holy Spirit when he is leading us into the wilderness?
Yeah, I think so. We see that with Jesus. It said he frequently withdrew and went to that place. Yeah. So for us to just have that as part of our rhythm, when we know we just need to be closer to God, we choose to go there. I have my home that I go to. It's a place. I have a church where I gather. That's a place. These are very important places for me. Yeah. And so Jesus talked about a place of prayer, or you shut the door in prayer. Yet we never see him going into a closet in that way, using that as a metaphor. Mm-hmm. But he was constantly in that place of prayer, where they even knew where to find him at the point of his arrest. So, I think it's good to have a physical place that we can kind of attach to going to a place for the purpose of seeking God.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this story of Jesus going into the wilderness, he is tempted by the enemy. And so we see that in the Bible, it talks about being tested, but also being tempted, and that we're tested by God, but we're tempted by the enemy. But those are two completely different things that sometimes we can mix up. Sometimes we can be not even sure which one of those things it is. Yeah. And so you talked about the distinction here, and you talked about how God knows what's in you, that is good, and he tests you according to what's in you. Yeah. And the reason for that test is to bless you. Yeah. God's not testing us so that we might fall, because we know that the word tells us that God doesn't tempt any man, right? Yep. And so he sees what's in you and tests you, but the enemy, he sees your weakness, and then according to your weakness, he tempts you. Obviously, his goal is to destroy you. Yep. And so sometimes we face these obstacles in our lives, and I know even for myself, you get to that place and you're like, is this the devil, or is this, Lord, is this a test from you? Maybe you can unpack that a little bit more, whether it would be from your own journey, but how have you arrived at that discernment of, okay, you know what, I don't need to rebuke the enemy right now. I just need to be sensitive to what God's asking me to do, so that I can persevere in this test rather than, resist this temptation. Yeah. What does that discernment look like?
Yeah, so for me, it's more awareness of self. Mm-hmm. So because at least in my life, it seems to feel like tempting and testing, it's just very similar. Mm-hmm. It feels similar. Obviously, it's not. Right. But if we were just going to, talk about a season of temptation versus a season of testing, or a moment of temptation versus a moment of testing, we would describe it very similarly.
Yeah.
So for me, I have to recognize, where am I weak and where am I strong? So by strength, what I mean is, what has been being taught, like faith comes from hearing the word of God. So if he's the author of my journey, then there are conversations I'm coming into. There are truths in the gospel that I've been studying or whatever. Those truths that bring faith, it's going to be tested. So, or what is something that I really said I believed 6 months ago that never got tested? I have it, like it's in me, I believe it, but I never proved it out per se. So I think it's easy to see, God is asking me to say something, to do something, to go somewhere, to be like, this is proactive obedience, whereas a temptation is, I'm in a bad mood today because I haven't slept. I'm burning out because I've worked X amount of days without a day off. So you can see, if I am being rude to somebody, or if in my personal life I'm getting lazy or whatever, it's because of a weakness. And I don't think it takes too much time to just slow down for 5 minutes and look at life and just say, okay, I'm feeling a little pressure here, but this is good pressure.
Yeah.
And then I'm feeling a little pressure here, but this is negative pressure. If I'm running, for instance, because I've decided to go run a 5K, you feel that, right? And you're tired, but you're testing your body. You're able to do it, or you should be able to do it if that's one of your things, versus I'm driving in my car and the tire is flat and this just isn't working, So I think if we just look at ourselves and say, is this a weakness of mine that is being tempted, or should be a strength that's being tested? I don't know if it's much how it feels versus who I am.
It's very helpful.
Yeah.
No, I think when you were speaking, I even thought about a scenario that I had recently where I had this opportunity to at least start to share the gospel, or at least invite somebody into the gospel, invite them to church, and it was an opportunity, and that opportunity didn't come from the devil.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
Satan wasn't tempting me to tell this person
To
about
preach.
Jesus.
Yeah.
But it was missed, and I do feel like, there are those moments where there's faith inside. We've been given the commission by Jesus to tell people about the gospel, and so when we have those opportunities and it's clear, we can recognize and say, all right, Lord, this is not the devil, like this is you. And so, leaning into that grace that he gives to actually, fulfill what he's called us to fulfill, as opposed to, just like you said, you're tired, you find yourself not acting Christ-like, or maybe the fruit of the Spirit is not, within you. Well, God is definitely not trying to, I don't think, give you less sleep.
Yeah, right.
And,
right.
Make chaos in your life
Yep.
to say, because that's temptation.
Yeah.
That's, and so that, I think you explained it really well. And so it's important I think, for us to be able to recognize, because I think it also changes the way we pray,
For sure.
and changes how we respond to the situation. If we believe this is an attack from the enemy or temptation, then we'll pray differently.
Yeah.
As opposed to, okay, Lord, this is you. Like, I've arrived here at this test, and now we can pray for grace.
Yeah.
To accomplish what we need to.
Yeah.
So that's really helpful. You talked about the 5K. I just have to slip this in here. This is really embarrassing, but there's a lady here at our church, a sweet older lady, leads a group, and just awesome, loves Jesus. But I came to church one day after running a 5K. And she said she was there at the race, and she said, I didn't see you. She said, where were you? We were at the finish line. All my sons finished. And
No.
I said no. I said I finished. She said, are you sure? I didn't see you. I said, yeah. And so I told her my time, and she laughed. And she said, no, really. I said, no, really, that's my time.
And you're not going to give us your time?
She thought, no, absolutely not. But she thought I was joking.
Wow.
And so anyhow, so that's
Have you worked on it since then?
it's coming up.
Okay,
I'm about to take on the next race.
All right,
So, but
all right.
I can absolutely relate to the running metaphor because, oh my goodness, yeah. All right. All right, let's move on a little bit and let's talk about this idea of resisting the enemy. So we see these three attempts of Satan to attack Jesus and to tempt him to do something that he wasn't called to do.
Yeah.
And so the first two times, you made note that Jesus did not rebuke the enemy. He had a word to resist, but he did not rebuke the enemy. And so on the third attempt, Jesus actually rebukes the enemy.
Yeah.
And Satan leaves. But you talked about how sometimes in our lives we see this example in the gospel that sometimes the first call is to just resist.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting that Jesus didn't rebuke him the first two times. I mean, he could have. You'd think he could have. But, I mean, clearly it's setting a precedent for us as well. And so so there's those times in our lives where we're just trying to rebuke. Well, we also have the command in Scripture to resist. And we see that later on, I think, and you might have to help me out with this, but when I think it's Paul says, resist the devil. And
James.
James, thank you. Gosh. And so let's talk through this because, this might be a new idea to a lot of us who are very used to just rebuking everything that seems to come against us. I guess the first question is why don't you think we resist well? And what can we do to do a better job at resisting? Obviously, you hit on these in your sermon. Clearly, a lot of it has to do with knowing the word and having the word to resist. But how can we grow in that? And then maybe after that we can talk a little bit about discerning when it's time to rebuke.
Yeah. I think sometimes we don't resist well because we've been taught to rebuke, right? Like as soon as there is any type of opposition, the idea, especially in spirit-filled circles, is to just rebuke the enemy. Because we have authority, but authority is in two spheres. It's resistance and or, rebuke. I don't have authority to resist a car. Like I've not been given the strength or the power to resist a car. So my only ability, if I could not move, would be to what? Rebuke the car. Like tell the car, go around or whatever. That's best case scenario, using kind of a ridiculous analogy. But we've been given authority both to resist and rebuke the enemy. And resistance, like when it talks about putting on the full armor of God, which may have been what you were referring to, which is Paul saying, resist the enemy. Like that, you're putting it on to be engaged in a battle with him. Well, if I'm engaged in a battle, that's not a rebuke.
Right.
I'm facing the opposition. And it seems like resistance to certain schemes of the enemy are a lifelong resistance. There are things that we resist at a young age. A lot of people talk about purity in these kinds of conversations and should, by the way. But as a middle schooler or a high schooler, most of these kids aren't great at resisting certain temptations. And then they have to get better, though, because eventually they're 40 years old, they're at work, someone in a cubicle next to them they might find attractive, but they're married and the other person is married. Well, if you didn't learn how to resist, what does a rebuke look like? It means that person needs to get a new job. So you may not have opportunity to rebuke. You have to resist. And so there are oppositions that are lifelong oppositions, and we just have to learn to resist them.
Yeah.
And we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, so we know it's the enemy, whether it's a temptation or whatever. We know it's the enemy trying to push us to something we shouldn't do. Greed would be another one. There are people who they just will not be generous because they're just going to hang on to things. I know people who are extremely generous today who had to resist not being generous 20 years ago, and they're far more generous today because they learned to be generous, not because it was ever natural for them. But learning to be generous really is just resisting being not willing to share, right? So if I resist the idea of being broke, then I'm more open to being generous.
Right.
So there are a lot of aspects of life that the enemy is going to just keep throwing at us. They're not going to just go away. I mean, they're weekly or daily or monthly, annually, whatever. So if we recognize that it's not just going to leave. I think we are forced now to cope.
Yeah.
So what is the word that I stand on in any time that temptation shows up? That's how I win. But I'm not winning because I rebuked him, the enemy.
Right.
I'm winning because I resisted him.
Yeah.
And I move on to the next conversation or whatever.
Right.
So, and rebuking, he has to leave. Like, get out of my house, right? And there are times we see that where the enemy is just rebuked and somebody is delivered, or the enemy is rebuked and we never battle that again. I mean, I think we've all met people who were addicted to things. Somebody prayed for them and it just lifted and they never ever dealt with it again. We also talk with people who it's been a decision for them to not be bound by these things, and they still feel the pull towards that weekly, but yet they're strong. They just resist. I would love to rebuke every single time.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we probably do more resisting than rebuking. Jesus did in this particular example. 2/3 of the time he resisted, 1/3 he rebuked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. So I just thought of the scripture, and again, you're going to have to be my reference, but Paul prays, he says, I pray that you'd be strengthened in your innermost being. And so even this concept of being strengthened, resistance is also a workout term.
For sure.
You have resistance bands, and you're growing as you're resisting. You're growing. Your strength is growing, and in order for us to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but strengthened spiritually so that we can do the things that we're called to do, it would seem that if we're just rebuking every single thing, then we're not actually using our spiritual muscles, so to speak, to grow and grow and grow, so that when we reach those new things that God has called us to do in the kingdom, that we have resisted right up to this point, and now we have the strength. God has given us the strength. He's strengthened us. And so it would almost seem if we just, it would be like wanting to just sit in the gym and just say, I want to be stronger. I want to be stronger. I want to be stronger. Don't be heavy. Don't be heavy. Don't be heavy.
For sure.
So I don't know if that's helpful too. That's the picture that I kind of got as well.
Absolutely.
As you're growing, you talked about like the middle schoolers, high schoolers, they're having to grow so that when they reach that opportunity. So that makes a lot of sense. Another thought I had is kind of a connection in the gospel. When you were telling this story, is in Acts 16:16, there is a demonic girl. She's demon possessed, and she's following Paul around for several days. And it's interesting that it's several days that she's following them around. And it said then Paul grows annoyed. And he rebukes her and casts the devil out of her. But it was interesting that he waited several days. And so I don't know why he waited several days, but it would seem that in the same pattern, he resisted, and then there came a point where he said, "All right, that's enough." And he commanded to leave. But so it seems like timing matters.
It does.
Timing matters, and you even said that because you said if we try to start rebuking something too soon, that our faith can become depleted.
Sure.
When it's not right. So we have to know the right gospel word for the right time. For you, is there any examples, or is there a way that you can describe when you've reached that moment of like, all right, like this is enough, like I've resisted, and now it's time to rebuke the devil.
Let's make it super practical. So using Paul's example and the lady who was saying, "These are men of the Most High God, hear ye them," and then he became greatly annoyed after many days. Let's just put it in let's say parenting. Again, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. We know that the enemy is against our families. We know that. So if the most immature in the household, which would be the youngest, if they would function, but do not take this to say I'm saying children are demon possessed. Absolutely not. When Peter looked at Jesus and said, you don't have to go to the cross, he wasn't possessed by the devil. And then Jesus said, get behind me, Satan, right? So, however, the most immature in the room can maybe be the ones who are most useful to the enemy's schemes. Let's say it like that. I don't want my children in an immature season, I don't want them to leave, right? I will have to resist certain behaviors out of them where I have to be the adult in the room. Then there comes a point over time when they themselves don't want to act like that anymore. Well, now we've reached that sort of tipping point where there can be rebuke in the sense of this behavior, it has to go right now. Well, it's possible that the lady that was saying these are men of the Most High God, she may not have been open to the idea, in her case would have been deliverance. She may not have been open to deliverance at first. But after she traveled with them, after she watched them, maybe she became to a place of awareness of what she was actually dealing with to where he could rebuke the enemy. And she wanted it gone and it left. There are people, whether we like it or not, they're not seeking to be free. They actually don't mind being rude or mean or jerks or whatever negative word we would want to apply. That's just who they want to be. Well, we just have to resist that. The urge to just kick them out of the room or what, we just have to deal with it. And it helps them get better because of our willingness to, I guess, endure, maybe. But then there does come a point where they're probably tired of being thought of the way they're thought of. And when they get there, that's where, okay, this behavior, it can't happen anymore. And that's where on work teams, you have to sit down with people and say, it's toxic, it's lazy, it's hurting the team, fix it, or we're not going to be able to do this. Yeah. So that's a point of rebuke versus, okay, I'm not going to react to that today. I'm not going to react to that word, conversation, whatever. I'm just going to resist. So I think timing is everything.
Yeah, no, that's huge. That's awesome. I think that's very helpful probably to a lot of different situations. All right, well, let's dive into week 2. Hopefully we can get through this in a reasonable amount of time.
All right.
So week 2 was all about ascending to that place in the Spirit where we can hear from God.
Okay.
And you talked about Moses and how Moses went to that place up on the mountain to receive from God. Kind of went back into Exodus chapter 3, where before Moses ever was called to lead the people of Israel out, that he was tending the sheep at the bottom of the mountain. And you said when you have communication with God, he wakes you up to the purpose of your life, which is for something greater.
Yeah.
And just this reality that as Christ followers, that we should always be seeking God. We should always be in relationship with God and hearing from God. And you talked about how where there was significant places on mountains or this mountain or that mountain that now, present day, we can ascend the mountain wherever we are.
Yeah.
But now we ascend to this place in the Spirit. Jesus said, you're not going to worship on that mountain or this mountain, but you're going to worship in spirit and in truth. And so I'm thinking about a mom at home. I'm thinking about somebody at work, in their workplace, in their car, wherever they're at, that they're having a difficult time, and they just need to seek God.
Yeah.
And they might not be able to travel all the way to Israel to climb up Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, but they need to ascend to that place in the Spirit. And I wonder if you can just kind of break down what would that look like for us, just to on a daily basis or when we really need a word from the Lord to ascend that mountain.
Yeah. So practically speaking, there are, I would say, 3 different ways that I might really, quote, get there. And one would be prayer. I I believe in a spirit-filled lifestyle. So when I say prayer, not just praying in your understanding, but praying with the Spirit also, which in other tongues I'm speaking specifically to. There's also worship where I don't sing much, so I don't worship a whole lot outside of, meaning worship as singing outside of church. I'm not a singer. So for me, it's far more prayer than it is that. And then the third way, which is probably the greatest way for me, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say it that way. I do a lot of prayer and I do a lot of meditation. Mm-hmm. So for me, meditation specifically on the Word is just a way to get there. And when I say there, it's where my consciousness is being more consumed by the text or the prayer time than I am with whatever was bothering me or whatever was going around. So for anybody, whether you work from home or you're in the office or whatever, I think you can break away to a place of just you, and it might be go outside the building, take a walk, and you just begin to pray in that place, and you will feel, I think internally, and we get into these very, very subjective words, but you will feel something shift. Your mindset, your sense of maybe heightened worry or whatever will just kind of be depleted in a moment, and it does seem like it's just you and Jesus. So when you get there, that place in your mindedness, I'm calling that place Spirit. Yeah. You've gotten in the Spirit. Yeah. And now that you're there, now what? Right? Like, is there revelation there? Is there just comfort there? Is there encouragement? What is in that place? Because I do believe God has, He has gifts for us in that place.
Yeah,
for sure.
Absolutely. No, that's good. So if you are following Jesus right now, then we can't stress enough, right? Like, find time to pray.
Oh, my word. Yeah.
Find time to worship.
Yeah.
And to get in that place. I agree with you. It is hard. You almost wish you could give this perfect, like, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, You're going to feel this way. But God works with every individual, and so really all we can do is what the gospel commands, which is to seek the Lord, pray, be in the Word, and then hopefully, if you're listening, you'll have a testimony of God meeting you where you're at.
Yeah.
I know we can both attest to that.
Yeah.
That it happens, and people in our church will absolutely attest to that. So the gospel, you talked about it, how it's either a cornerstone or a stumbling block. Mm-hmm. That, either we desire the gospel and all of it, without trying to edit it, or people stumble over it. And so I think this is such an important concept to hit on in today's society, because as somebody who is very much been a people pleaser, whether it would be friends, family, I think come into this revelation that, like, listen, either you're going to embrace the gospel or you're going to reject the gospel.
Yeah.
It's not in between, right? And so, how do we do this without coming off as, I don't know what the right word is, but without, if our fear is, and maybe this is a fear we shouldn't have, mm-hmm. but if our fear is, well, I want to make sure that I'm not scaring someone away, how do we share the whole gospel without fear, but also not, and again, this might not be right thinking, but not coming across as, where I guess we're being the stumbling block, where we feel, I don't want to be the stumbling block. Jesus is the stumbling block. How have you approached that in your life? Have you always felt the same way about this, or have you kind of had to grow in this in your personal walk to just really embrace the whole gospel?
Yeah, I think you're constantly growing, constantly evolving. Things I would have thought a year ago that I think differently about today, just because this facet of the gospel maybe seems more clear. It's hard. So I think what you're asking is, when the gospel is offensive, basically we don't want to say it because we don't want to offend somebody and keep them from embracing the gospel, right? We want to be liked, and everybody wants to be liked. However, it does seem like we're in a unique period of time where anything that seems to be from a growth mindset is viewed as negative. And so there are these unique pockets where you have openness in learning, and then you have these other areas where we just seem very closed-minded. So coaching has become much more quiet than maybe coaching used to be. But yet if you go to elite athletes, that's not true. Now, Little League, it's true, and this is going to be a terrible thing to say, but what happens is when you get a whole bunch of people playing something that they're not very good at, that they don't really even necessarily want to do, well, you have to coach them differently because they're never going to do well at that. Now, they might be able to get better, but they're not going to do well. And it's the same thing in academics. There are people who are really good writers, and we've decided that if somebody's not a great writer, let's go ahead and lower maybe benchmarks so that they're more comfortable writing. And then the person who would be better has to seek tutoring elsewhere in order to get better. So I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's what's happened. So as we have flooded the market with people, and whatever the market is, as we flooded it with people who may or may not want to be good at something, it is what it is. Okay. Now let's take somebody who doesn't want the gospel right now. They are closed to the gospel. We have to handle them differently than someone who's open to the gospel. Because if I'm open to the gospel, I need to hear the truth of it. If I'm not open to it and you give me the truth of it, you're going to offend me. That's true, but I never wanted it anyhow. So my offense in some ways doesn't matter. Now, the flip side of that is they would have been ready in 6 weeks, but you jumped the gun, you made them mad. Now instead of being ready in 6 weeks, it's going to be 18. Can that happen? For sure. And I think that's why when Paul talked to the Corinthians, he said, I didn't preach anything to you except Jesus and him crucified. Well, when he first came, that's true. What is hard is for us knowing where, okay, if I'm on social media and that's just being sent to everybody, maybe that should be more just Jesus and him crucified. But if I'm in the church where all the saints have gathered, there are going to be some in the room who they're new to Jesus or they don't know Jesus yet, but do I not disciple the ones who have gathered because the others are in the room? Right. That I think is the tension of the day, yeah. Right? And for me, I would show greater caution to not disciple than to offend. But in a public forum, I would show greater discipline to not offend that I might evangelize. Yeah. So it's more, I guess to me, it's more location than it is anything. Our message to the world should be bringing them in. Yeah. Our message to the church should be making us better. And that's one of my complaints of the kind of the modern seeker movement is we gather all the saints on Sunday, and instead of preaching the word, we treat it as an evangelistic meeting. To some degree, I understand the point, but then we end up having a lot of immature Christians who eventually, if they stay in their sinfulness, they just fall away from the church. Yeah. So I think we're missing a number. We're getting excited about how many people we're bringing in, but we're ignoring how many people we lose because we don't disciple. And both are important. Yeah. More people today are leaving church than are coming in. So clearly we're not very good at discipling. We haven't seen that here, but I mean, you hear the numbers nationwide. Yeah.
Well, and this whole discussion comes out of John chapter 6, the example you used when Jesus shared the hard teaching.
Yep.
I mean, Jesus did it.
Absolutely.
And
Yep.
There were people there that walked away.
Yep.
And there were people that stayed.
Yep.
that received the word. So I think that you said it well, and hopefully we can be more courageous about sharing the gospel and not fearing man. So
yeah, well, one more thing there. Like if you say that you're sort of a people pleaser, I don't think that's a bad thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I really don't. I don't think we should just seek to offend. Like for you may be somebody who you want to find a kinder, gentler message to bring people into the kingdom. And that's a particular calling. I might be a little more aggressive on the abrasive side, and that's going to look different from now. Should I soften some? For sure. For sure. Should somebody who never preaches the hard truths or speaks the hard truths of the gospel, should they be willing to be a little more a little more open? Yeah, for sure. If you believe something, I think we should have the courage to say it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's good. I mean, I think that's what this is all about, is us becoming more whole, more complete into what God has for us as people that are being transformed into the image of Jesus.
Yeah.
So I feel like, man, this is probably the longest one we filmed so far. I probably have to end it here. But there's more that we'll get to next time. Is there anything you wanted to add at the end, Pastor Shawn?
No, I'm good.
No? Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. Once again, we hope that you'll continue this conversation as you follow Jesus wherever you are, and also help lead others to follow him as well. So we'll see you next time. God bless.